Hello, I'm Justin Moss, and happy to have a moment of your time to consider Gluck's masterpiece, Orfeo and Euridice, Orpheus and Euridice. This is an opera which is based on the ancient Greek myth of Orpheus. Orpheus was a son of the muse Calliope and one of the Thracian kings. He was a great and gifted musician who, it was believed, could move the rocks on the hillside and reverse the course of rivers through the sheer beauty of his singing and playing of the lyre. He was famous for this music making and underwent one of the great and resonant stories of antiquity. It was said that he had married the love of his life, Euridice, and she was bitten by a snake and died shortly after their wedding. He was so pierced with sorrow that his song of lamentation moved the hearts of the gods to the point where they allowed him an opportunity to return to the underworld, retrieve his Euridice, and bring her back up to the world of the living. There was one condition, though, and that was, as they ascended back to the earth, he not look at her. She, of course, can't understand why he refuses to look at her or speak to her. And on the path back up to the world of the living, she begins to doubt the wisdom of even following him. If he doesn't love her anymore, she can only believe that to be the reason that he won't look at her. Finally, her pleading becomes so desperate that when he has stepped into the world of the living, yet she still remains one step behind, still in the cave, he turns, looks at her, and she dies a second time. He loses her again. And in this wonderful opera of Gluck's, of course, we have yet another opportunity, because his mourning is so genuine and so moving that he's told that once again the gods have been moved to allow him a second chance. Let's look back into another ancient world, and that is the one of my youth. I can remember being in record stores that sold 33 1/3 RPM vinyl long playing discs, and I was coming to learn opera. I was trying to hear as much of it as I could, and I can remember being at the bin with the Gluck operas, and herein I found a recording of Orfeo and Euridice, with the role of Orfeo sung by a tenor, Nikolai Jeda, by a baritone, Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau, by a number of mezzo-sopranos, and I scratched my head thinking, can this major role in one of the central operas in the canon simply be up for grabs for any voice type that comes along and wants to sing it? And it was many, many years of misunderstanding what all that confusion meant before I found a path through it, if you will. This path I would like to share with you because I think it's helpful, because indeed it is confusing to see all these different singers turning up in this same opera. Gluck wrote his opera for an audience in Vienna, where it would premiere in 1762. At this time, the most famous and certainly the most highly compensated singers in the whole world were the castrati. These were men who, as adolescents, had been castrated, which kept their voice from changing. They never attained that deep, resonant, masculine voice that accompanies puberty. And as they grew up and matured in years, their voices became huge and robust, and yet still very, very high-pitched, like a child, basically. They learned tremendous vocal skills. They could sing great fioratura, coloratura, roulades, many notes very, very quickly, and they were the rage of society. Most of the famous countertenors had patrons who kept them in villas, and they came before the crowds who went wild, cheering and screaming and whatnot. Well, this was who was expected to be heard in a new opera by Gluck in Vienna in 1762, and indeed it was a big success. And the castrato he was able to obtain for these performances was one of the most famous of his day. A number of years later, it was planned to have a production of this opera in Paris. The French people, however, considered the act of creating a castrato to be an offense against nature, a position I would be hard-pressed to mount an effective defense for. And so it was clear that a castrato was not going to work in Paris. So what to do? Gluck looked around and saw that the most popular singers in Paris at this time were a class of tenor that they called a high tenor. And these were guys who had been trained to sing in a very, very high tessitura that was an astonishingly difficult and taxing thing, but very, very effective dramatically. And there were a few of these guys around. He thought, well, this will do. It'll be a different sound from the sound that the castrati made, but it'll work and it'll be effective. He rescored the role, and indeed the opera had a really good success with this French high tenor voice. The opera continued to be heard for a number of years, but then as bell-bottom pants go, it went out of fashion. And it wasn't heard for a long time until the mid-1850s, when it was decided it was time to revisit this work, and the great Hector Berlioz was enlisted to prepare an edition. Well, what to do? It seems that during the interval of nearly 100 years, all of these high tenor voice types had vanished. It was no longer being taught. There was no one practicing it. So it was a real problem for him. What was he going to do? Berlioz was not going to be able to access and have a success with one of the few remaining castrati at that time. He couldn't find anyone who still sang that very high tenor range. So he looked around and saw that one of the most famous singers in Europe at that time, Pauline Veradot, was available to him. She and her sister, who was a few years older and was a soprano, Maria Malibran, were arguably the two most famous singers in all of Europe at that time. They were sort of like Renata Tebaldi and Maria Callas. Huge followings, greatly popular. And Pauline Veradot was available for this production, and he Berlioz rescored Gluck's score to accommodate a mezzo-soprano. She had an enormous success with the production, and it was the rage of Paris and played for many, many, many performances, and it pretty much established the tradition of producing Gluck's Orfeo et Euridice with a mezzo-soprano. This was the version that we heard for many, many years. As people looked at the score and revisited it, though, it became clear that there were a lot of options, a lot of opportunities to do different things. Hence, we had a really gifted tenor like Nicolai to come along, who could sing in that incredibly taxing high tessitura, and he was able to make a recording of the piece as it was scored for the high tenor, the high French tenor. Today, we more and more turn to a voice type that came along in the early 1990s, which we refer to today as the countertenor. These are guys who've learned to sing in a very, very high range in a full voice. It's not falsetto, where normally a male would resort to falsetto to sing in that tessitura, that high range. It's a full voice sound. It is beautiful, and we've had masters who became major, major opera stars who were countertenors who've come upon us over the last couple of decades. David Daniels certainly was one of these. He sang Nero in Monteverdi's The Coronation of Poppaea for us here, and also returned to sing the title role of Julius Caesar for the first time. It became a signature role for him, and he essayed it for the first time here in South Florida with Florida Grand Opera. We, in our production, are going to feature both a countertenor, one of the leading exponents of this style in the world today, Anthony Roth Costanzo, and we'll also have a mezzo-soprano singing some of the performances. So this is a terrific opportunity for us at Florida Grand Opera to have you buy not one but 2 tickets to this production, so you can come back and see and have a completely different experience with the same opera and the same music sung by an artist approaching it in a very, very different way. But I confess to you, having never in my life seen a performance of this opera, Gluck's Orfeo et Euridice, I attest to knowing every bar of music in the score from recordings and have known all my adult life, certainly all the important big musical numbers, but this is my first opportunity to see this work. I didn't broadcast that around because I felt it was a pretty glaring exposure of my ignorance, until I began to learn that a number of friends of mine who've been following opera for as long or even longer than I also have never had an opportunity to actually see this work, of which they have known and to which they have listened for many, many years. I think it's coming back, though. We're seeing productions of this opera given all the time and all over the world now. So I think, like bell-bottom pants, who knows, you may see them coming at you down the street as early as tomorrow. Justin Moss for Florida Grand Opera, welcoming you to an astonishing experience with one of the truly central pieces of the whole operatic canon, Gluck's Orfeo and Euridice. I'll see you at the opera.